Violent pink ink settled into the plastic window, sealing her life sentence. Arthur stepped into the doorway, dragging the sharp scent of rain and cold concrete into the sterile bathroom. His face remained completely impassive. Slowly loosening his silk tie, he held her gaze and whispered, "I got you pregnant on purpose." The bathroom smelled like bleach and expensive sandalwood. Naomi sat on the closed lid of the toilet, the cold porcelain seeping through the thin fabric of her silk robe. In her right hand, the plastic pregnancy test felt unnaturally heavy, a tiny white baton dictating the rest of her natural life. She didn't cry. Crying was a useless biological function, a waste of water and salt. Instead, she stared at the two violently pink lines until they blurred, her heart hammering a dull, erratic rhythm against her ribs. "It's wrong," she told herself. "It's a false positive." She had controlled everything. Every morning at precisely 8 o'clock, the alarm on her phone vibrated against the nightstand. She would swallow the tiny, bitter pill dry, washing it down with whatever stale water was left in her glass. For 6 months, she had lived in Arthur's penthouse, a collateral asset paying off a debt her brother left behind. 6 months of sharing his bed, breathing his air, and carefully counting down the days on a mental calendar until the debt was cleared. She was supposed to leave next Tuesday. Her suitcase was already half-packed, shoved deep beneath the guest room bed where Arthur's housekeeping staff wouldn't see it. The heavy mahogany door clicked open. Naomi didn't look up. The shift in the air pressure was enough to announce him. Arthur carried a scent that was entirely his own. Sharp vetiver, black pepper, and the faint metallic ozone of the city streets. He didn't ask what she was holding. He didn't rush to her side with feigned concern. He stepped into the bathroom, his leather shoes completely silent against the heated marble tiles, and stopped in front of her. "You missed breakfast," Arthur said. His voice was a low, even baritone, entirely devoid of inflection. Naomi slowly raised her head. He was dressed in his usual immaculate armor, a charcoal three-piece suit, the jacket unbuttoned, his black hair combed back but slightly damp from the morning rain. He looked entirely ordinary, a businessman, a CEO, not the head of a syndicate that controlled half the city's underground ports. She held up the plastic stick. Her hand was trembling, a violent tremor she couldn't suppress, no matter how hard she clenched her jaw. "I took my pills," she said. Her voice sounded like it was coming from a great distance. It was raspy, stripped of its usual defiant edge. "Every single day, Arthur. I took them." Arthur looked at the test. His expression didn't change, but his dark eyes shifted, locking onto hers. He reached out, his long, pale fingers gently plucking the plastic stick from her trembling grip. He examined it for a fraction of a second before tossing it effortlessly into the brushed steel trash can. It hit the bottom with a hollow clatter. "I know," he said softly. "Then how—" Naomi started, her throat suddenly constricting. Arthur reached up, his knuckles brushing against her jawline. The contrast of his cool skin against her flushed face made her stomach pitch. She tried to flinch away, but her body felt leaden, glued to the porcelain seat. "I swapped them," he stated, as casually as if he were discussing the weather. 4 months ago. The new pills are a vitamin compound, good for your immune system." The words hung in the sterile air, heavy and suffocating. Naomi's brain stuttered. It refused to process the syllables. Swapped them. She looked at his face, searching for the punchline, for the cruel, arrogant smirk he usually wore when he cornered an enemy. But there was no smirk. He looked intensely calm, relieved, almost. "You." She stood up, the sudden movement causing a wave of dizziness to wash over her. She stumbled, her hip catching the edge of the granite vanity. "You tampered with my birth control." "Yes." The raw, unadulterated violation of it hit her like a physical blow. The air punched out of her lungs. Her vision tunneled, the edges of the room going black. "Are you insane?" Naomi's voice cracked, rising into a shout that bounced harshly off the marble walls. "Are you out of your fucking mind, Arthur? The deal was 6 months, and the ledger is wiped clean. I leave on Tuesday." Arthur didn't move. He stood perfectly still, letting her scream, absorbing the panic rolling off her in waves. "You aren't going anywhere on Tuesday, Naomi," he said. The quiet authority in his tone was worse than if he had shouted back. She lunged at him. It wasn't a calculated move, it was pure, unthinking animal instinct. Her open palm cracked across his left cheek with a sickening smack. The force of it sent a jolt of pain up her arm, her wedding ring, the fake, heavy diamond he made her wear for public appearances, biting into her own flesh. Arthur's head turned sharply to the right. He stood there for a long moment, the only sound in the room the ragged, desperate panting escaping Naomi's lips. Slowly he turned his face back to her. A faint red mark was blossoming across his sharp cheekbone. A tiny bead of blood welled at the corner of his mouth where his teeth had caught the inside of his lip. He lifted a thumb, wiping the blood away, and looked at the smear of red on his skin. "Feel better?" he asked, his voice a gravelly whisper. "I'm calling a clinic," Naomi choked out, backing away from him until her spine hit the cold glass of the shower door. "I'm getting rid of it, and then I'm walking out that door." Arthur closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't grab her wrists, didn't pin her to the glass. He simply crowded her space, caging her in with his height and the overwhelming gravity of his presence. He leaned down, his mouth inches from her ear. She could hear the slow, measured intake of his breath. "You won't," he breathed, the words vibrating against her skin. "Every clinic in this city knows my name. Every doctor in a 50-mile radius knows who you are. If you walk into a waiting room, they will call me before you even fill out the paperwork." Naomi squeezed her eyes shut. A hot, furious tear escaped, tracking a burning line down her cheek. She hated herself for crying. She hated him for making her. "Why?" she whispered, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a hollow, yawning terror. "You have everything. You have money, power, women throwing themselves at your feet. Why do this to me?" Arthur's hand moved, his palm flattening against the soft silk covering her flat stomach. The heat of his hand seeped through the fabric, a burning brand claiming territory. "Because you were actually going to leave," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, heavy with a dark, twisted conviction. "I saw you packing that bag under the bed. You thought you could just pay off a ledger and walk away from me. You thought I would let you." He tilted his head, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "I got you pregnant on purpose, Naomi. You are mine now, forever. You and the child." By nightfall, the city was drowning in a torrential downpour. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse living room, the city lights below looked like smeared neon paint against the black glass. Naomi sat in the center of the massive curved sofa, her knees pulled to her chest. The plush velvet fabric, which usually felt luxurious, now felt like a straitjacket, suffocating her with its softness. The apartment was dead quiet, save for the rhythmic drumming of the rain and the low, distant hum of the central heating. She had spent the last 6 hours oscillating between blind rage and a paralyzing, icy numbness. She had scoured the apartment for her phone, only to find it missing. The landlines were dead. The private elevator required a biometric scan to operate. Arthur's fingerprint, or the thumbprint of his head of security. David. She was locked in, a bird in a gilded 50-story cage. From the kitchen, the scent of sesame oil, roasting garlic, and seared beef drifted into the living room. It was an objective fact that Arthur was an exceptional cook. On the rare nights he was home before midnight, he would strip off his jacket, roll up his sleeves, and stand over the stove, finding a strange, methodical peace in chopping vegetables and searing meat. Naomi's stomach gave a hollow, aching rumble. She felt nauseous, but the deep, biological hunger gnawing at her insides was impossible to ignore. She hated her body for wanting the food. She hated her body for adapting, for preparing to harbour the parasite he had planted inside her. The clinking of porcelain plates broke the silence. "Eat." Arthur walked into the dimly lit living area carrying a tray. He set it down on the glass coffee table in front of her. A bowl of perfectly steamed white rice, thinly sliced bulgogi, and a small dish of pickled radishes. A glass of iced water sat next to it. No wine tonight. Naomi didn't move. She stared at the tray, her jaw locked tight. Arthur took a seat in the leather armchair opposite her. He had changed into a dark grey cashmere sweater and loose trousers. He looked relaxed. Too relaxed. He leaned back, resting his elbows on the armrests, his dark eyes unblinking as he watched her. "Starving yourself won't change the biology of the situation," he said smoothly. "I'm not hungry," Naomi lied, her voice raspy. "You're shaking." "I'm cold," Arthur sighed, a short, sharp sound. He leaned forward, picked up the bowl of rice and the chopsticks, and held them out to her. "Take it, Naomi. Don't make me treat you like a child." The condescension in his tone snapped the fragile tether holding her temper in check. Naomi uncoiled from the sofa, her hand lashing out. She struck the bottom of the porcelain bowl. It flew out of Arthur's grip, shattering against the hardwood floor. White rice scattered like snow across the expensive rug. Silence descended on the room, heavy and absolute. Naomi stood there, chest heaving, waiting for the explosion. She waited for him to stand up, to yell, to show the terrifying, violent mobster she knew lived beneath the expensive suits. She had seen him order a man's fingers broken for skimming off a shipment. She had seen him ruin lives with the stroke of a pen. But Arthur just stared at the broken porcelain near his leather slippers. Slowly he reached down, picking up a jagged shard of the bowl. He turned it over in his hand, his expression entirely unreadable. "My mother bought me these bowls," he said quietly. His voice carried no anger, only a chilling, detached nostalgia. "When I bought this apartment, she told me a man with a home in the sky still needs to eat from the earth." He placed the shard on the tray. "I'll have David bring up another set tomorrow," he continued, looking up at her. "Sit down." "No." Naomi backed away, her bare feet stepping dangerously close to the scattered ceramic. "I want to talk about my brother's debt. I want to talk about the contract." "There is no contract," Arthur replied, leaning back in the chair again, completely unfazed by her outburst. "The ledger was burned this afternoon. Your brother's debt is cleared. He is safe. You kept your end of the bargain." "Then let me go." "I can't do that. You said—" "I know what I said," Arthur interrupted, his voice finally sharpening, cutting through the air like a blade. "I said a lot of things 6 months ago. 6 months ago, you were a transaction. You were leverage to keep your brother from talking to the feds." He stood up. Naomi instinctively took a step back, her heel crunching down on a grain of rice. Arthur closed the space between them slowly. Not aggressively, but with the steady, inevitable pace of a predator that knows its prey has nowhere to run. He stopped a foot away from her. "But then you moved in," Arthur said, his voice dropping, taking on a rougher, darker texture. "You sat at my table. You slept in my bed. You looked at me like I was a monster, but you never flinched when I touched you. You stopped being a transaction, Naomi. You became a necessity, Naomi swallowed hard, the bitter taste of bile rising in her throat. "You're sick." "Probably," Arthur agreed without hesitation. He reached out, his fingers lightly gripping her waist. He didn't pull her flush against him, but the hold was ironclad. "But I'm also efficient. I knew you were too stubborn to stay voluntarily. I knew you were counting the seconds until Tuesday. I needed a permanent anchor." "A baby isn't an anchor," she spat, pushing against his chest. It was like pushing against a brick wall. "It's a hostage." Arthur's gaze dropped to her mouth, then slowly moved down to her stomach. His thumb stroked the curve of her waist through the silk robe. "Call it whatever helps you sleep at night," he murmured. "But you will carry it. You will have the best doctors in the world. You will lack for nothing. And when the child is born, you will raise it here, with me." He looked back up into her eyes, and for the first time that day, Naomi saw a crack in his stoic facade. It wasn't weakness. It was a terrifying, burning obsession, barely contained beneath his skin. "I will burn this entire city to the ground before I let another man raise my child," Arthur whispered fiercely. "And I will bury anyone who tries to help you leave me. Do you understand?" Naomi stared at him, the reality of her nightmare finally, truly sinking into her bones. He meant every word. There was no escape clause, no buyout. She was drowning, and Arthur was the water pulling her under. "I hate you," she whispered, her voice cracking, completely hollowed out. Arthur's grip tightened on her waist for a fraction of a second, before he leaned down, pressing his lips to her forehead. The kiss was jarringly tender, completely at odds with the monstrous cage he had just built around her. "I know," Arthur said, softly against her skin. "I can live with that." Month 5 arrived with a suffocating heatwave. The penthouse air conditioning hummed constantly, a low-frequency vibration that Naomi felt deep in her molars. Her clothes no longer fit. The sleek pencil skirts and silk blouses Arthur had bought her 6 months ago were banished to the back of the massive walk-in closet, replaced by soft, expansive cotton and cashmere that felt entirely foreign against her skin. She hated the softness. It felt like a concession. She sat on the edge of the plush examination table, specially installed in the East Guest Suite. The room smelled sharply of antiseptic wipes and the chemical, metallic tang of the ultrasound machine. Dr. Hayes, a graying woman with clinical, emotionless eyes, squeezed cold blue gel onto Naomi's swollen belly. Arthur stood in the corner. He had not missed a single appointment. He never hovered directly over the doctor, preferring to watch from the shadows near the blackout curtains, his arms crossed over his chest. He wore a crisp white dress shirt today, the sleeves rolled up to expose the faint edge of a sprawling black tattoo winding up his left forearm. He was a man composed of rigid lines and suppressed violence, but in this room, his focus was absolute, terrifyingly still. "Heartbeat is strong," Dr. Hayes murmured, her eyes flicking across the glowing monitor. A rapid, rhythmic whooshing filled the room, sounding like a washing machine running on a loop. 145 beats per minute. Growth is exactly in the 50th percentile. Naomi stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the tiny perforations in the acoustic foam. 1, 2, 3. If she did not look at the screen, it was not real. It was just a medical procedure, an illness she was slowly recovering from. But the steady thump, thump, thump echoed in her own chest. Her body was betraying her, actively working to sustain the life Arthur had forced upon her. "Do you want to know the sex?" Dr. Hayes asked, the plastic wand pausing just below Naomi's navel. "No," Naomi said instantly. "Yes," Arthur countered, his voice cutting through the sterile air like a dull knife. Naomi snapped her head toward him, her hands balling into tight fists on the crinkling paper of the exam table. "I said no, Arthur. "It is my body. It is my child," Arthur replied, his dark eyes locking onto hers. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet certainty in his tone was an immovable object. He stepped out of the shadows, the heels of his leather shoes clicking against the hardwood floor, and stopped beside the monitor. "Tell me, Doctor." Dr. Hayes did not hesitate. She worked for Arthur, just like the security guards downstairs and the private chef who prepared Naomi's iron-rich meals. "It is a girl, Mr. Kim, a girl." The air in Naomi's lungs turned to glass. She could not breathe. A girl, a daughter, another woman destined to be trapped in this suffocating, violent world. She looked at Arthur, expecting to see a smug victory, the arrogant satisfaction of a man getting exactly what he wanted. Instead, Arthur looked devastated, not disappointed, devastated. His rigid jaw went slack for a fraction of a second. He stared at the grainy black and white image on the screen, a muscle ticking violently in his cheek. He reached out, his fingertips brushing the plastic edge of the monitor, as if he could touch the tiny, fragile spine curving inside the digital static. For a brief, agonizing moment, Naomi saw the boy he must have been before the syndicate hollowed him out. A man terrified of the fragile thing he had created. Then the mask snapped back into place. He lowered his hand and turned to Dr. Hayes. "Leave us." The doctor hastily wiped the gel from Naomi's stomach with a rough paper towel, packed her briefcase, and practically fled the room. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving a vacuum of silence behind. Arthur stood by the bed. He did not try to touch her. He just watched her pull the oversized cotton shirt down over her stomach. "A girl," Naomi whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Are you going to lock her in a tower too? Or are you going to sell her to pay off someone else's debt?" It was a cruel thing to say. She wanted it to hurt. She wanted to draw blood. Arthur did not flinch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy platinum money clip, turning it slowly between his long fingers. "She will never know the world I came from," he said quietly. "She will never owe a debt. She will never be afraid." "She will be terrified of you," Naomi shot back, swinging her legs over the edge of the table. "Perhaps," Arthur conceded, looking down at his hands. "But she will be alive, and she will be safe. You are a monster, Arthur. You know that, do you not?" He finally looked up, his eyes flat, dark like a bruised sky. "I am whatever I need to be to keep you both here. Wash up. Dinner is in 20 minutes. He turned and walked out, leaving the door slightly ajar. Naomi sat alone in the quiet room, the ghostly echo of the heartbeat still ringing in her ears. She pressed a trembling hand to her stomach. Beneath her palm, a tiny, distinct flutter rippled against the uterine wall. A kick. The first one. Naomi closed her eyes, a single hot tear slipping down her cheek. She was losing the war. She hated the flutter. She hated how it made her breath catch, how it triggered a primal, protective instinct that overrode her logical mind. The baby had not asked for this. The baby was entirely innocent, a hostage just like she was. Naomi dug her nails into her palms until sharp crescents of pain grounded her. She could not love this child. To love the child was to accept the cage, but as another soft flutter bumped against her hand, Naomi knew she was already lying to herself. Month 8. The tipping point. The physical toll was immense, a heavy, dragging anchor pulling Naomi deep into the earth. Her ankles were chronically swollen, her skin stretched tight and painfully itchy over her massive stomach. The baby sat low on her pelvis, a heavy stone that made drawing a full breath impossible. It was 2 a.m. A violent summer storm battered the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. rain slashing against the thick glass like thrown gravel. The city below was entirely obscured by thick, grey fog. Naomi sat in the leather armchair in the dark living room, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. She could not sleep. Lying down sent a burning acid reflux up her throat, and her lower back throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. Down the hall, the heavy mahogany door of Arthur's study was cracked open. A slice of yellow light spilled onto the hardwood floor. She could hear his voice. It was not the low, controlled baritone he used with her. It was a vicious, guttural snarl. "I do not care if he bleeds out in the alley," Arthur's voice carried over the sound of the heavy rain. "He skimmed from the southern docks. You break his hands, then you break his knees. Make sure the rest of the crew watches." A heavy pause hung in the air. "Did I stutter, David? Do it." The line went dead. The silence that followed was suffocating. Naomi squeezed her eyes shut, pulling the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. "This is who he is," she reminded herself. A butcher in a bespoke suit. She needed the reminder. Over the last few months, the lines had started to blur. Arthur was the man who rubbed unscented lotion into her aching feet. He was the man who woke up at 4 in the morning to heat up milk when she could not sleep. He was the architect of her prison, but he was also the only person who seemed to care that she was surviving it. A sharp, sudden pain seized her lower abdomen. Naomi gasped, her hands flying to her stomach. Her entire uterus tightened, turning rigid as a bowling ball. The pain radiated around to her back, stealing the breath from her lungs. It lasted for 30 agonizing seconds before slowly releasing, leaving her slick with a cold sweat. "Naomi?" She opened her eyes. Arthur stood in the doorway of the living room, the yellow light from the hall outlining his tall frame. He had shed his suit jacket and tie. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his hair messy from running his hands through it. The vicious mob boss from 3 minutes ago was entirely gone. He crossed the dark room in 3 large strides, dropping to his knees on the rug in front of her chair. He smelled of dark scotch and expensive cigar smoke. "What is wrong?" he demanded, his voice tight, bordering on frantic. He reached out, his large hands hovering over her stomach, terrified to touch her and cause more pain. "Is it the baby? Is it time?" "I do not know," Naomi breathed out, gripping the padded armrests. "It just cramped, really hard. I am calling the doctor." Arthur reached into his pocket for his phone, his long fingers visibly shaking. It was a tiny detail, but it hit Naomi like a physical blow. The butcher's hands were shaking. He was not acting. He was not playing a sick game of control. He was completely, utterly terrified. Another wave of tightness started to build. Naomi groaned, her head falling back against the leather chair. Instinctively, without thinking, her hand shot out and grabbed Arthur's wrist. Her nails dug into his skin, right over his pulse point. His heart was racing, beating violently against her fingertips. Arthur dropped the phone on the rug. He did not pull away. He moved closer, sliding his hands under her heavy wool blanket to grip her bare calves, anchoring her to the ground. "Breathe," he commanded softly, his dark eyes locked entirely on her face. "Just look at me, Naomi. Breathe through it." She met his gaze in the dim light. There was no arrogance in his face, no ownership, just raw, desperate vulnerability. For a split second, the cage doors vanished. It was just the two of them, isolated in a glass box above a storm, weathering the terrifying reality of bringing a life into a brutal world. The contraction peaked, a burning vice around her middle, and then slowly ebbed away. Naomi let out a long, ragged exhale, her grip on his wrist gradually loosening. "It is stopping," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Braxton Hicks, forced labor." Arthur let his head drop. his forehead resting heavily against her knee through the wool blanket. She could hear his ragged breathing, the sudden release of adrenaline leaving him hollowed out. He stayed like that for a long time, kneeling on the floor at her feet. Naomi looked down at the dark, messy hair covering his bowed head. Her heart twisted with a sickening, contradictory ache. She hated him for forcing this life upon her. She hated him for manipulating her body, for trapping her in a world of violence and blood money. But as she sat there, feeling the protective warmth of his hands holding her legs, the undeniable truth settled into her bones like lead. She was exhausted from fighting. The anger, the defiance, it took too much energy. Energy she needed for the daughter currently kicking against her ribs. Slowly her hand moved from his wrist. Her fingers hovered in the cold air for a second before dropping down, burying themselves in the thick, dark strands of Arthur's hair. Arthur went completely still. He did not look up, but his grip on her calves tightened perceptibly. It was a silent conversation, a surrender, not of love, but of reality. "You ruined my life," Naomi whispered into the dark room, the words devoid of heat. It was just a statement of fact. Arthur slowly lifted his head. His eyes were dark, fathomless pools in the shadows. He looked at her hand, still resting in his hair, before his gaze travelled up to meet hers. There was no apology in his expression, no remorse, just the chilling, triumphant realization that he had finally won. "I know," Arthur said softly, his thumb tracing a slow circle over her ankle bone. "But we are going to build a new one." Naomi did not pull away. She leaned her head back against the chair, listening to the rain batter the glass, and closed her eyes. The cage was locked, the key thrown away. She was Arthur's, completely and entirely, bound by blood and a tiny, racing heartbeat. It was a tragedy, a manipulation, a permanent life sentence. And God help her, she was going to survive it. If Naomi and Arthur's dark, twisted journey pulled you in, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more intense, grounded romance audio dramas. We drop new, raw stories every single week, exploring the messy, complicated sides of love and power that other channels will not touch. Do not forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below. Did Naomi make the right choice? See you next time.